Welcome to Immigration Insider with your host, Attorney John Nicelli. This podcast is an educational forum on how to deal with complex aspects of immigration and pitfalls to avoid. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, johnnicelli.com. Now here's the host of Immigration Insider, Attorney John Nicelli.
Good morning, everyone. My name is John Nicelli. I'm an immigration attorney for the last 42 years, and I practice exclusively in the field of immigration law for all those years. And today I want to speak about citizenship and how things that are required of how to become a citizen. So the basic requirement to become a citizen is first, you have to be a permanent resident of the United States, or a conditional resident for that matter. But if you file when you're a conditional resident, you'd have to probably wait eventually to become a permanent resident, even though you could file sooner before you actually become a permanent resident. But not to confuse you, we'll make things simple, okay? So if you are 18 years old and the basic requirement is that you must be 18, you have good moral character, meaning you have no major arrest, and you've been physically present in the United States for at least 5 years, then you're eligible to file for an application for naturalization. If you obtained your residence based on a marriage and you're married to a U.S. citizen, then you're only required to be a permanent resident for a period of 3 years. So if you're a permanent resident for only 3 years, you have to wait exactly 3 years of marriage. You have to have 3 years of physical presence and 3 years of being a permanent resident, and then you're eligible to file. When you're filing under the 5-year rule, you can file 90 days before your 5th anniversary. So there is a little bit of a distinction there. There is one exception to that rule, and there are many things to consider when people become citizens. But if you go into the military as a permanent resident, there is basically no waiting period. And there are resources within the military, different branches, who will actually help you to become a citizen, help you fill out the application, tell you what's required. One of the requirements is that you have to file a Form N-426, which is a request from the Department of Defense to verify your military service. So that is a major, major advantage in becoming a citizen. I've had many clients that became permanent residents and shortly thereafter went into the military and almost within just a few months became U.S. citizens. And then usually what they'll do is they'll file for their family members. What's required is when you go for your citizenship exam is there are 100 questions that you need to study. And those questions basically involve the history of the United States. You have to answer 6 of those questions correctly. So they'll use 100 questions basically, but you have to ask 6 correctly. If you answer 6 out of 10 correctly, then you're going to be fine and you'll be passed. Provided you also know basic English, because you have to speak English and you should know how to write basic English. You don't have to be fluent in English, but you should be able to write, I live in the United States, or Washington is the capital of the United States, or the Pacific Ocean is on the west coast of the United States. Simple things like that, they will ask you to write. And if you can write that in English, you should be fine. If you, for some reason, don't get 6 questions right out of the 100 that they can choose from, then, and you'll fail, you usually will have a second opportunity to take the exam again. Usually what they do is when someone does fail, they will then tell you, okay, we'll give you like a few weeks usually to come back. And when you come back a few weeks later, a month later, whatever that is, you actually will be required to take the test again, ask the similar questions, and if you get the 6 right, you're going to pass. If you don't pass and you do fail on the second chance, then you have a right to file an appeal. Most of the time, it's a waste of time to file an appeal, because if you fail twice, that means you're probably deficient in either the language or the history of the United States, and you should really study more or practice more in writing or learning English. I always recommend taking courses to speak English, and that usually will generally get you through. Now, there is an exception that applies depending on your age. So if you're 50 years old and you've been a resident of the United States for at least 20 years and have lived in the United States all that time, or the majority of that time, you can take your test in your native language. So if you speak Spanish or German or Russian or any language of the world, you basically can speak it, you can take the test in your native language. So those questions would be asked to you, and normally when you do what they call the 50-20 exemption, there are less questions. There are specific questions that they'll choose from, but it's not all the 100 questions. It's a significantly reduced amount of questions that you have to study. There's also another exemption called the 55-15 exemption. That means that if you're 55 years old and you've been a resident at least 15 years in the United States, then you can take the test in your native language. And again, you must study the specific questions that from the pool of questions that they could ask you. And the only difference is that you'll have to take, you'll be asked and answered all the questions in your native tongue. All right. There is also another exemption. Let's say that you have a disability, or for some reason you've been in the community here for 15 or 20 or 30 years, never filed for citizenship, and you haven't done so because you don't speak English. Well, there's also something called a medical exemption. If you'd have to get a form, it's a form called an N648, where a medical doctor would fill out this form, which is a number of pages, and it's about your medical history. And basically, the doctor must explain why it is that you're incapable of learning English and cannot take the English test. When you file this form, I always recommend that before filing, you should go to a doctor who's authorized by immigration. Usually, if you go to an authorized doctor from the immigration service, that's probably a better chance of you passing your test, because many times they go to these doctors, they pay them, and the doctor may write some frivolous report, which is not going to be accepted. So it's always best to go to the doctors who actually are certified by immigration to be civil surgeons and authorized to do medical exams. So if you file what they call an N648, and it relates to a disability or some problem that you have, which is causing you to not have the ability to learn English, then the form, the 648, is filed at the time of filing. If you file your application and you file the N648 later, your application will be denied, or it just won't be accepted. So you'd have to refile again if you speak no English. All right, so keep that in mind. That's very, very important. Now, let's say that you fail the test. And if you fail the test, as I said earlier, you could appeal. There's a form called an N366, which you can file. Generally, I don't recommend that. And one of the reasons is because many times when you do that, you file an appeal, but then often the same examiner that denied you the first time is actually going to be responsible for hearing your appeal. So it's not really recommended. All right, for many, many reasons, but that's one of them. Okay, so let's say there's other ways of becoming citizens as well. Let's say you were born abroad. Okay, so there's laws of what they call acquisition and derivation. So acquisition means you acquired your citizenship at birth, or derivation means that you derive citizenship generally through a parent at the time of your birth. So there are different rules for acquisition and derivation, but a very basic rule would be if you were born abroad and both your parents are U.S. citizens, or one of your parents is a U.S. citizen, and they've previously lived in the United States for a period of time, then you can probably become a U.S. citizen with no problem. You'd file at the U.S. Embassy abroad. You can also, if you qualify for citizenship, you meet the criteria. For example, say both parents are U.S. citizens and both parents lived in the United States for a period of time before your birth. Then, if you qualify, then you can just file for U.S. passport at the U.S. Embassy abroad. No need to file for certificate of citizenship. A lot of people don't know that, but you can directly file for a passport without having to file for a certificate of citizenship. Now, if you were born abroad and you're living in the United States and you became a permanent resident but never knew you could have been a citizen, there's certain criteria where you can file what they call an N-600. An N-600 means that it's an application to file to obtain a certificate of citizenship. And again, that would apply to people who were born abroad and when at the time of their birth, they actually became citizens but didn't know it. Or it could have been that you derived citizenship later on. That's a complicated area of law, and we have charts for acquisition and derivation. So it all depends on your date of birth, your place of birth, how long, when your parents became citizens, and if they were citizens at the time of your birth, and also how old you are at the time you're filing. Now, if you were a citizen at the time of your birth and never knew it, well, the 18-year age requirement does not apply. So if you became a citizen, but you never knew it and you were born abroad, you could be 40 or 50 years old and still obtain a certificate of citizenship because you actually became a citizen at the time of your birth, and that's called acquisition. The laws of derivation are slightly different, far more complex, but it would depend on the date of birth and where you were born, when you were born, your parents becoming residents, and all that kind of stuff. So, and if you file based on just obtaining a certificate of citizenship in the United States, assuming you qualify, there's a form N-600. If you're abroad and you qualify, there's a form called an N-600K. In addition, let's say you become a citizen, and this is quite often that people will lose their certificate of naturalization or the certificate of citizenship. And they go crazy because they have to travel and they may not have a passport, and there's a delay in the passport office, as it was last summer for many, many months. So you have to file what they call an N-565, which is for a lost citizenship certificate or naturalization certificate. You file that form, immigration will generally approve it within a few months. It's a little bit costly. If you need to have an emergency, you'd have to call immigration at their customer service number, their 800 number. It's 800-375-5283. That's 800-375-5283. And you tell immigration that, listen, I have an emergency. I lost my certificate of naturalization or citizenship. I can't get a passport because the backlog is months away, and you need a certificate right away to travel. So they will expedite it for you, and then hopefully you can do the same thing with the passport office, because passport, if you have all the requirements for a passport, including a certificate of naturalization or citizenship, generally you can get a passport within 24 hours if it's an emergency. So that's the way I would proceed if that were the case. Also, there's another thing that I think you should know is that if you are going to be assigned a job abroad, so let's say you're a computer tech, for example, or a banker, and your company has a branch office overseas, and they're sending you overseas for a year or two. Well, if you're a permanent resident, that's going to interfere with you becoming a citizen because now you're not physically present in the United States. So there are exceptions. You can file a form called an N-470, which is an application to preserve residence for naturalization purposes. And with that form, in order to qualify, you'd have to be employed by the United States government, by a U.S. company, by an international agency for which the United States government is a member, for example, like the United Nations or the World Food Program, one of those agencies. Then you can probably preserve your residence for naturalization purposes. So when you finish your tour abroad, you can come back to the United States and you can just file citizenship immediately, assuming you had the time in before you left. In addition, if you were a priest or minister and you were assigned abroad, many times some of the churches or synagogues or whatever, or the mosque, will assign one of their members abroad for a year or two or three. So again, you can if you're a permanent resident and you're stuck abroad for the next 2 or 3 years because of an assignment, when you come back, that time abroad cannot be used against you if you filed the N-470 application to preserve residence for naturalization purposes. And one last thing on becoming a U.S. citizen. United States Citizenship and Immigration Services has a website called uscis.gov. If you go to that website and you go under citizenship head, under the headline citizenship, and there are many, many resources that for learning how to become a citizen. They have all the questions there. There's material that you can study. There's study guides. There's multiple various teaching tools where if you actually review all this information, you should have no problem passing the citizenship test because the resources are there to help you. If you don't speak English, then you'd have to find a medical reason why you don't speak English, if that's the case. So that's the basics of becoming a U.S. citizen. And if you have any questions, you can always call my office at 212-227-8020. We're located in Lower Manhattan in New York City. We're 1 block from the World Trade Center, 1 block from the Fulton Street train station. As most of you know, just about every train comes through Lower Manhattan, some way, somehow, and also the path from New Jersey. So if we can help you, we'll help you. You can call us, as I said, 212-227-8020, or you can send us an email at john@johnnicelli.com, and we always answer our emails. All right? Thank you very much, and lots of good luck to everyone.
You've been tuning into Immigration Insider with your host, Attorney John Nicelli. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, johnnicelli.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.